Hey guys, I'm coming at you with this slightly unexpected / unplanned video in our usual schedule, and it's not quite one of my hot take iPhone videos because although I do love doing those and I have a lot of hot take type feelings on this subject, I also recognize that it's a topic that requires a lot of nuance and accuracy. So I wanted to include a good amount of research and really think about what I was saying, because we are going to talk about weight and bodies and eating disorders and just a lot of other things that can be pretty difficult to talk about. So I want to start this video by giving a quick trigger warning that if anything related to bodies, weight, food, etc. is a sensitive topic for you, as well as looking at some images of some, quite frankly, extremely thin celebrities, this is not the video for you. I will not be offended whatsoever if you pack your suitcase and get out of here right now. This is your stop. But for the rest of us who feel at least reasonably comfortable with having this conversation, I do think it is a conversation that is extremely important to have, and one that I think, like many online conversations, is just in a dire lack of nuance. And I say that particularly as someone who has in the past taken a GLP-1. I am not currently taking one. I haven't taken any GLP-1 drugs for essentially the entirety of 2026 at this point. I'm not saying I would never take them again, but it's just not something I'm currently doing, but it is something I have done. So I do think that I come at this subject both as someone who has taken these drugs before and also as someone who is on camera damn near every day for her actual job. And I've talked about in a recent video here the impact that that can sometimes have on mental health as far as it pertains to appearance and the image that we're selling, because unfortunately, anytime part of your brand proposition is being physically visible to people, unfortunately, your looks are kind of part of that brand proposition. I think with all of that in mind, I do have, I think, somewhat of a nuanced take on this issue that I would like to share. And just generally, I think it's a conversation that is worth having from a place of good faith and not sensationalism. Before I get to this video, which again, I hope you will bear with me because I know it's a very sensitive topic, but I tried to approach it with as much nuance as I could. Before we get to it, I just want to reiterate, we do not work with many brands here. We try to be very careful about what we promote and make sure that it is, by and large, financial products that we use and trust and swear by. If you have been wanting to get better with your money and you want to support us, we try to run a very ethical business. We are women-owned and operated. We are very transparent in how we operate. We're very fair in our pay structures, profit sharing, 6 weeks PTO, 4-day work week, all of that. If you want to help support us and you want to better your own finances, we recommend Monarch. It is my budgeting app. It is the one I started using even before we were working with them when I was looking for a mint replacement. You can, using our link, get a free trial and half off of your first year. Cannot recommend it more. It is a genuinely wonderful budgeting app for essentially all of your day-to-day financial needs. Betterment, if you are looking to start investing but don't really know how to do it, it is an extremely easy to use robo-advisory that just basically you set it and forget it, and you can benefit from all of the long-term wealth building of investing in the stock market without really having to do anything or know anything about the stock market, because let's be very clear, you should not be out here individual stock picking. You should just be broadly diversified in low-fee index funds and let it ride. Use our link below. And lastly, if you are looking to level up your finances and use a financial advisor, which I've been doing for several years now, we highly recommend advisor.com. They are a wonderful team. We do tons of ongoing education with them every quarter, free financial education for our audience. They are also a flat fee advisory service, which means that they work for you and not for commissions, and everyone pays the same regardless of their net worth. And they're just, a really good company, and we wholeheartedly endorse them. All three are linked below. Let's get to the video. But to give you a little bit of context, if you are out of the loop, and if you are, God bless you, stay that way forever, never Google anything. But basically there has been, I would say, nothing short of an epidemic of celebrities looking really weird. There's been a little bit of everything in terms of celebrities no longer looking very recognizable. And I should also say that this is increasingly kind of a gender neutral phenomenon. Some of you guys may have seen the recent kerfuffle around Jim Carrey appearing on a red carpet not looking like himself. I will actually reference co-host of Good Noticings and former guest on TFD, Ashley Hamilton, who had a great TikTok about this the other day that I'll put here, basically just saying it's really noteworthy that when a woman shows up on a red carpet looking very unlike herself, we just exoriate her for being a victim of vanity and beauty culture. And when a man does, you get headlines like this, people speculating on whether or not this man is a clone or is using a body double or things like that. I think the answer is almost certainly no. Jim Carrey has not been cloned. Jim Carrey is not an alien. He probably just got some work done like many people in Hollywood around his age, and it doesn't look all that great. Not dissimilar to someone like a Bradley Cooper, for example. But while this is definitely an increasingly gender-neutral phenomenon, and a lot of the celebrity appearance discourse is centered around their face and often attempts to look younger than their actual age, a huge part of this conversation is around celebrities, for lack of a better word, looking skinny as hell. As we can see in some of these photos, some of the celebrities that we are seeing look just frankly quite frightening, quite visibly ill, are people who used to be heavier and in many cases were just brutally mocked by the press and by the public for daring to be a visible person while overweight. You also have the other side, which are famous people who have sort of always been thin while they've been in the public eye, but are now at a level of thinness that seems like we are, if anything, days away from hospitalization. You, in that category, have cases like Bella Hadid, who is very frequently posting photos from the hospital, ostensibly for chronic Lyme disease, which is a digression I will not go on this video because I am not trying to fight with the quote unquote chronic Lyme warriors on here. But let's just say that is a very dubious diagnosis at best. And those of us who watched The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills from its inception when her mother was a cast member for several seasons, we know how far the Hadid mother, Yolanda Foster, went to ingrain disordered behavior in her daughters and basically admonish them for eating anything over than a handful of almonds on a daily basis. So suffice to say, Bella Hadid's very frightening recent appearance and the fact that she is frequently in the hospital, I am not personally, from a common sense POV, comfortable entirely chalking up to quote unquote chronic Lyme disease. But that's its own story. Point being, celebrities are getting extremely thin before our very eyes, sometimes starting from a place of thinness, sometimes not. And to be clear, being skinny as kind of an aspirational or attractive state has gone in and out of fashion over the years and over the centuries. It isn't new necessarily for the rich and famous to want to look very thin. But what has been consistent, whether or not skinny happened to be in vogue, is that what is generally considered to be very aspirational for the elite is what is less achievable for the general population. Quote, throughout history, the beauty standard of any given period has served the ideological interests of the ruling class. During the Renaissance, plump, pale skin was a prized signifier of high social status, while sun-darkened skin became synonymous with lower classes laboring outside. Today, however, the same tanned complexion is desirable, coming as it has in the West, to indicate leisure time, holidaying abroad, and the luxury of disposable income. But what's interesting in the very recent years is that with being thin becoming slightly more accessible than it has in the past with the rise of GLP-1 drugs, one might argue that what has become aspirational amongst celebrities is not just being thin, which has kind of been the case ever since we've seen a serious uptick in obesity in not just our country, but the Western world, but being obscenely thin, much thinner than even the average person could hope to become. Because as we'll get into a little bit later in this video, it is very, very unlikely that for a lot of these celebrities who are maintaining dangerously low BMIs, that it is simply a question of quote unquote Ozempic. What's also true about our current moment and the beauty standards that come with it is that we are not existing in a vacuum of what happens to be published in magazines or appear in films and television. We are living out celebrities' appearances in real time on a second-to-second basis on these extremely unforgiving and algorithmically driven platforms. Places like TikTok, where constant body checking and weight loss driven quote unquote glow ups are essentially a hallmark of the genre. I won't name any of them because it honestly feels like punching laterally in a video on YouTube like this, but I can think of so many influencers off the top of my head, and I'm sure you can too, whose like first order of business on getting a certain level of fame or income on their platform is just dropping an enormous amount of weight and getting a ton of cosmetic procedures done. And this is not to say that that is wrong inherently. That is very much playing the game, and I understand why they do it. Trust me, I have to see myself on camera all the time. I know the feeling. But it's also just worth noting that like this is the context we are living in, where we are being scrutinized on a second-to-second basis. And often, unfortunately, what is rewarded is just managing to look as thin and as young as is plausibly possible. But again, even that is on a razor's edge, which we'll discuss in a second. We're also in an epidemic of things like what I eat in a day videos, where incredibly thin young college students will post about the things that they get to eat at their campus cafeteria in between incredibly intense cardio workouts. And these are also platforms which are unprecedentedly young. The average TikTok user is literally a teenager, and these are the platforms where a lot of these celebrities are appearing and building their brands and interacting with their audiences. They're competing against children in many cases. And they're on that razor's edge that I mentioned, whether it's with the anti-aging stuff or the weight loss stuff, where if it goes well and looks good, like let's say a really good facelift, you are celebrated for it. But anyone who gets work that is slightly off or not as well done or not as successful gets excoriated for it, even though in both cases you're getting work done. The same can be said for weight loss. There is a very, very, very fine line between what we consider to be like body serving tea, the glow up is real, etc., and someone who looks like they need to be in a hospital. And anytime someone, especially a woman, but as we can see this happens with men too, anytime someone steps over that invisible line, they are completely fair game to mock and humiliate. But as it pertains to celebrity weight loss, I want to talk specifically about the GLP-1 of it all. Because basically anytime you will see a video of a celebrity looking scary thin on social media, all of the top comments will be like, Ozempic hit her like a train, or like, the Ozempic is Ozempicing, or whatever the case may be. Basically, people chalking that weight loss up to the use of a GLP-1 drug. The implication, of course, being that people who are already thin are overwhelmingly using these drugs to get down to really unhealthy weights. There's also historically been a kind of socioeconomic or ethical issue with this, in the sense that for a time, GLP-1 drugs were actually in shortage of production. And so there was an argument that the people who could afford to pay really high premiums for them were taking them away from, let's say, diabetic patients who actually needed them. But since the 2nd of October 2024, quote, the US Food and Drug Administration has determined the shortage of tirzepatide injection, a glucagon-like peptide medication, has been resolved. Tirzepatide injection had been in shortage since 2022 due to increased demand. So you could at least say that the rich and famous aren't quote-unquote taking these drugs away from people who really need them. But now we kind of have the opposite problem, which is like the hyper ubiquity of these drugs. They are incredibly saturated in advertising. Many of you probably saw basically endless advertisements for them during the Summer Olympics, including promotions from athletes who openly admit to not even using them. You have celebrities like Serena Williams doing massive ad campaigns for GLP-1. In her case, her husband is actually an investor in the company she was promoting, so that's also a little bit ethically complicated. There are essentially countless B2B startups and apps that will easily connect whoever wants GLP-1s with the drug. And now that they are increasingly available in pill form, they're becoming even easier and, in many people's view, more socially acceptable to take. There was actually a really interesting article in The Cut recently about this, about the impact that GLP-1s being available as a pill rather than a shot will have on people taking them. Quote, over and over, women told me that these pills gave them permission to enter the world of medical weight loss. Tara said that taking them feels like one step beyond going to Duane Reade and buying vitamins. The 42-year-old has PCOS and read that GLP-1s might help with symptoms like infertility, high blood sugar, and inflammation. Another woman, Jill, told me that she likes that the pill is more discreet than the injections that she was taking. She no longer has to hide vials and needles from her house cleaner or someone that she's dating. Quote, I don't want some guy opening my refrigerator and seeing my diet pens, she says. It's embarrassing. Intellectually and practically, I do understand why there is increasingly a backlash against these drugs, right? Because they're being very heavily marketed to Americans, but also to women specifically. I also should say I'm in France currently, and although the marketing for these drugs is not the same, because unlike in the US, which is the wild, wild west in terms of pharmaceutical advertising, there are very, very heavy restrictions around that. GLP-1s are quite prevalent here. I know many people in France who have taken them or are on them. So I just want to clarify that. It's not an American exclusive issue, but it definitely is much more prevalent in our culture, both because of our relationship, I think, to things like obesity and type 2 diabetes, but also because we're allowed to advertise the hell out of drugs, which I want to be clear, I think should be illegal for any type of pharmaceutical, but that's a different story. But so you have their ubiquity, and you have this sudden seeming epidemic of insanely, insanely thin celebrities essentially dominating our social media feeds. So I do understand why there is a backlash. This is where I do want to say, as I mentioned, I did last year take a GLP-1 and had an extremely positive experience with it. I did an entire 8-minute video about this on my TikTok last year where I broke down my experience and also just a transparency around it, because I did not lose an enormous amount of weight, in part because I had never gained a huge amount of weight to begin with. I basically went from being about 25-ish pounds over what had historically been my normal weight for almost a decade to going back down to what had always been my regular size and fitting back into my clothes. At no point throughout this process was I ever medically underweight or anywhere close to it. I was briefly medically overweight, but the range was not huge for me, but I did still feel like, I just want to be a transparent person with my platform always, whether that's to do with my money or any kind of cosmetic interventions or weight loss or anything like that. I think it's kind of my responsibility, especially as someone who does have this public platform and really advocates for transparency in media, but also specifically because I didn't want someone to say, oh, I think Chelsea looks like she's lost a little bit of weight since last year. I wonder how she did it, and not have the full picture of the truth. Now, if you want to get a full breakdown of my experience on a GLP-1, it is linked in the description. I don't want to go on an 8-minute digression about it here, but suffice to say, I am someone I've mentioned many times on the channel who has historically dealt with anxiety, and I went through some incredibly stressful times over the past few years, specifically to do with my business and it being really struggling. We're in a good place now. We give it up to God, thank God. But in all seriousness, my way of coping in that moment with serious anxiety was to really heavily binge eat sugar. That has always been a problem for me. And it really flared up, especially in like the 2022 to 2024 time period. And I felt really debilitated by it, kind of ashamed of it. It was a really vicious cycle. And for those who are not super familiar with GLP-1 drugs, one of the really interesting impacts they have is a profound effect on any kind of compulsive behavior or even anxiety-driven behavior. A lot of people who take these drugs report that they lose interest in things like drinking, smoking cigarettes, gambling, online shopping, really anything that's being used to kind of artificially regulate your nervous system or give you quick dopamine hits. That was certainly my case. I basically stopped binge eating sugar overnight, but I essentially also reduced all of my other bad habits. And even though I've not been taking these drugs for about 4 months now, I still feel those effects. Like I'm still not really that interested in binge eating or doing anything that is kind of a self-soothing measure from that perspective. I joked in my TikTok that I feel like a GLP-1 is the only thing in my life that has ever like genuinely cured my anxiety, which is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but having taken a lot of pharmaceuticals over the years, not for many years now, but especially in the early days of being diagnosed with generalized anxiety, nothing has ever had the benefits except for one other thing that I can't really talk about on here because it's for those who have read How to Change Your Mind, but you'll get what I'm talking about. But anyway, suffice to say, it has been hugely impactful in a positive way for me. And yes, weight loss was part of it. Like I said, I had been at a relatively stable weight for the better part of a decade, ballooned up in a relatively short period of time, felt uncomfortable all the time, couldn't wear any of my clothes. And I was really happy to have some help in getting back down to the size I had always been and feeling more comfortable in my body. It also helped kickstart a lot of really healthy habits for me that have continued. Like I said, I'm not taking them currently, but I still get these days between 15 and 20,000 steps a day, which is kind of crazy. But it's been very helpful for energy levels, maintaining a healthy relationship to hunger cues, and just generally I sleep better. Like I could list forever the benefits that I've felt from these drugs. Your mileage may vary, but I can say quite certainly that having been, and I was, just for clarity, not on Ozempic, I was on Mounjaro, but whatever. I can just say though that for me, I know many people who have taken these drugs, some who disclose, some who don't, but that's another story. Pretty much universally, I've never heard someone have a negative experience with them. I don't doubt that they exist, and for some people, there are more serious side effects than others. I didn't really have any. But I will just say, especially with people who have really historically struggled with things like weight loss, PCOS, compulsive eating, or other compulsive behaviors, these drugs do feel miraculous and genuinely help a lot of people live much healthier lives. So I say all that to say, when you see a photo of an extremely unhealthy celebrity who was already at a normal or underweight BMI to begin with, suddenly becoming extremely thin, the fact that our first comment is something like Ozempic or what have you, it feels a bit frustrating and disingenuous to me because, to be very clear, when you look at the larger data around GLP-1 drugs, far and away, these are not being used by already skinny people to get insanely skinny. That is not how these drugs are being used in aggregate. First of all, because there aren't that many skinny people in America to begin with. But even still, most people are using them to either get to or stay within a healthy weight range. Period. Let's start there. And it's also very helpful for them overall in terms of living a healthier life. But I also think it's extremely naive to assume that celebrities who are getting and staying really thin are doing it exclusively or even primarily through GLP-1s. Lest we forget, many other drugs have historically been abused in order to stay thin, some of which are other types of pharmaceuticals that are being used off-label, such as amphetamines, which are, let's be clear, still very popular amongst the unhealthy weight loss set, but also illegal street drugs that also help you stay very thin. There's also standard issue disordered eating, which can these drugs be a part of? Absolutely, but are not necessarily required to do. And I think that there sometimes can be an unfair extra speculation on GLP-1s in particular about, well, some people are abusing them, so they're sort of inherently not good or should inherently be regarded with judgment or skepticism. I would disagree and say that the potential for misuse is there with essentially every category of drug, and I don't think a drug's efficacy or value to the people who take them in a healthy way should be judged by the people who abuse them. Again, even assuming that these ultra-thin celebs are exclusively getting there via Ozempic or whatever. But anyway, all of that is to say, to me, that is often the first part of nuance that is deeply missing from this conversation. That's either idolizing ultra thinness, which we're going to discuss here, but many people very much still do, or really demonizing and stigmatizing these weight loss drugs, which I think is just not really fair to do either. Especially when you consider, and this is the other area where I fear we are missing nuance, and I'm a little bit treading lightly here because I don't want to get canceled, but we also have to acknowledge what is currently happening in America from a health perspective and the backdrop against which this is all occurring. I'm just gonna have to say this. I know that some people are gonna really flip out on me in the comments, but there's really no way to have this part of the conversation without acknowledging that obesity in America is a thing. It is a problem. It leads to really devastating health outcomes for all kinds of people and has been increasing over the past, let's say, 40-ish years. If you don't accept that that is true, we just can't find any common ground on this part of the conversation, but at least to some extent, the data doesn't lie here. It's also worth noting that there have been recent efforts to change how we categorize obesity because BMI, as many people have pointed out, is actually not a sufficient marker of overall health in relationship to the amount of fat that we have. But unfortunately, in making those criteria more nuanced and more inclusive of different ways that unhealthy levels of adipose tissue can negatively impact the human body, By those metrics, America actually has more of a problem. Quote, "We already thought we had an obesity epidemic, but this is astounding," said co-first author Lindsay Foreman, a Mass General endocrinologist and an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. Traditionally, obesity has been defined by BMI, which estimates body fat based on a person's weight and height. But other anthropomorphic measures, such as waist circumference, waist-to-height ratio, or waist-to-hip ratio, may further account for fat distribution and aid in differentiation between muscle and fat mass. Under this new framework, a person is classified as having obesity if they have a high BMI plus at least one elevated anthropometric measure, a condition the authors term BMI plus anthropometric obesity, or if they have a normal BMI and at least two elevated anthropometric measures, a condition termed anthropometric-only obesity. Obesity prevalence was 68.6% with the new definition versus 42.9% under the traditional BMI-based definition. This increase was entirely driven by inclusion of individuals with anthropometric-only obesity. Obesity rates varied by sex, race, and especially by age, affecting nearly 80% of adults over 70. And I want to say here that I think part of the reason that this conversation gets so convoluted with regards to obesity and the impact that it has on American health is because it has historically been so moralized and so full of judgment and stigma and shame. And I want to acknowledge that, at least for me, one of the most valuable parts of taking a GLP-1, or what I've seen in terms of conversations with other people who have also taken these drugs, is it really makes so clear so quickly how much this is not a character flaw. This is not a personal issue. This is not a lack of willpower. This is a result of living in an environment for prolonged periods of time that is really designed to make people unhealthy and to keep them unhealthy because it's very lucrative to do so. Something that we know, but I think often don't necessarily put language to, is that obesity is much, much more complex than just a lack of willpower, and it is arguably much more driven by the impact on hormones, metabolism, and brain function that we get from eating specifically so many ultra-processed foods in America. It is also impacted by things like our extremely sedentary culture, heavily reliant on cars, sitting constantly, etc. But ultra-processed foods really are one of the things in America that we can directly point to and say, like, these are making us very unhealthy, even compared to other wealthy Western nations. Quote, overall, about 55% of total calories consumed by Americans aged 1 or older came from ultra-processed foods, according to one report. For adults, ultra-processed food made up about 53% of total calories consumed, but for kids through age 18, it was nearly 62%. The top sources included burgers and sandwiches, sweet baked goods, savory snacks, pizza, and sweetened drinks. This is not to say that these foods are the exclusive reason why we're suffering so many downstream negative health impacts, including obesity and related issues, but it is an enormous part of the problem because, quite literally, these foods are designed in a literal laboratory to be addictive, to make it very difficult to eat or focus on or be sated by other things. They are designed to be addictive in the way drugs are designed to be addictive, and we can see that their impact on the brain is very similar to that of a drug. And so it's really important to say that, like, Americans who are overwhelmingly dealing with the negative impacts of being addicted to these foods, and Diva, we've all been there, myself included, need to both acknowledge that that is not a personal failing, that is the system working as it was designed to, but it doesn't mean that it's not a problem. And it doesn't mean that getting treatment for that problem or moving away from that problem is not a healthy thing. So I think the other area of nuance that we've been really missing in this conversation is, like, when you look at scale, on no pun intended, of what America's problem actually is, like where we're really seeing the most disastrous outcomes for the largest amount of people, like it is overwhelmingly not people being too thin. Like, that does exist, and having it in the public eye, especially when we are still dealing with an obesity crisis of this magnitude, like it does increasingly feel like a very sinister performance on the part of a few rich, famous, beautiful elites to sort of demonstrate how much restraint that they can exercise in the face of just an overwhelming availability of really, really, really unhealthy, nutritionally void, calorically dense, ultra-processed foods. But that is not the average problem here. I also want to note that, like, there is something so particularly sinister given America's really troublesome relationship with ultra-processed foods, how much these visibly extremely underweight celebrities try to seem relatable via pretending to eat these foods all the time. Like,
probably eat pizza at least once a day.
Celebrities on red carpets, like going out of their way to gorge themselves on a burger so they seem funny, even though they've undoubtedly been starving themselves for weeks leading up to the red carpet so they looked as perfect as possible in the photos. Like, grotesque, utterly grotesque. I completely understand why it elicits such a visceral reaction in us and why it feels so offensive and so insulting to our intelligence and why it's easy to focus on these ultra thin celebrities. But I do think we cannot lose focus on the fact that that is a different problem. It is not a problem. It is also not the biggest problem. And just because they exist does not mean we need to lean into the extreme of therefore demonizing anything that is helpful to weight loss. Like, those two things to me can coexist. Like, yes, some people can be very publicly unhealthy about weight loss. And weight loss is not inherently a bad thing. Targeted weight loss is not always an indicator of vanity, or wanting to be unhealthy, or wanting to perform a certain type of beauty in a certain type of way. Like, I think we can separate those two things and also note that the scale of those two problems is different. It just is. I also want to acknowledge, although I'm not going to get really into it in this video because we actually have a whole video about it coming later this month, about specifically the impact of BMI on earning potential, because that is a whole other thing. Like, women are very much punished for being overweight, and it is absolutely not lost on me that part of the reason it is so valuable for celebrities, people in the public eye, to be thin, especially very, very thin, is because of that correlation with their perceived value and their earning potential, because basically no industry is as fake it till you make it as the entertainment industry. And I know, like, to quote American Beauty, one must project an image of success at all times in order to be successful, and it would be dishonest not to mention that, again, especially for women, thinness is very much correlated with being perceived as successful, affluent, etc. It is a bit of a chicken or the egg scenario because growing up very thin is also heavily correlated with socioeconomic status. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I do just want to acknowledge that, like, there is a big class implication to performing thinness. But again, on average, that is not the more prevalent problem in the US. All of that said, though, the last place where I fear we are just, like, allergic to nuance is this conversation around it not being okay to comment on someone's body. To me, the perfect example of this was the interminable Wicked press tour, where we had essentially 2 full years of having to watch a cast where every woman on that cast was getting dangerously thin in front of our eyes, including people beyond our 2 stars, although a lot of the attention was focused on the 2 main actresses in that movie. And there was just, like, a lot of generally strange, confusing behavior happening on that press tour period. But then also there was this never-ending cycle of discourse. It would essentially be like, they look extremely thin, it's very worrisome, followed by, don't comment on their bodies, followed by, is it actually feminist to acknowledge when women are disappearing in front of us, followed by, actually it's feminist to be any size we want to, and if they're happy, we're happy, and so on and so forth. Like, never ever ending. As a feminist who really dislikes a lot of quote unquote choice feminism, and a good example in this case of quote unquote choice feminism would be like, actually, if a woman wants to be dangerously underweight in the public eye for years on end, that's her feminist choice and she should slay, and it's actually chic or whatever. Like, that to me is complete nonsense and very dangerous, especially for young girls. I think the quote unquote feminist take on the issue of what to do with especially women who are performing extreme dangerous thinness in the public eye on a constant basis is probably pretty muddy, in the sense that I do think that we are on average much more critical of women's appearances and don't hold men to the same standard. Although, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I do think it's increasingly becoming a pretty gender neutral thing of, like, if you look bad on a red carpet, let's say, and you specifically look bad in a way that seems as though you tried to look better and failed, which is often what we're talking about here, you will get ripped to shreds. And I guess in the case of men, you'll be accused of being a body double or a clone. And in the case of women, you'll just be accused of being a vain, miserable bitch. But regardless, it would be dishonest not to acknowledge that we definitely focus more on women's appearances than men's. True. However, I do think that it is very disingenuous and unhealthy and dangerous to normalize, let alone to glamorize women being very visibly dangerously underweight. Like, one area where I will not engage with like the, I guess, theoretically progressive nonsense is like pretending I don't have basic fucking common sense and acknowledging that like, hey, this woman who's dangerously underweight is obviously dangerously underweight. Like people saying like, we don't know what's healthy for her, blah, blah, blah. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. When a woman is my height, I'm almost 5'7". If she's on a red carpet, clearly in the 85 to 95 pound range, like she is very unhealthy. She is sick. Like I'm not going to participate in the absolute nonsense that is pretending we don't know what's right in front of our eyes. Let's start there. I think it is important to acknowledge what is reality and what is common sense. And someone might come into this and then say, well, how is that any different from pointing out when a woman is really overweight and acknowledging that for what it is and acknowledging that that is often unhealthy or can have negative health implications? Let's also put our thinking caps on here and acknowledge the fact that one of those two things, being visibly underweight and being visibly overweight, is heavily valorized and reinforced in our society. One of those things is already considered aspirational and the other one is not. As we've discussed, and I didn't even read the quote because it's really long, but I'll link this study in our description. You can see a very clear tie, again, more for women than for men, on being overweight having a very negative impact on your perception, other people's implicit bias of you, your earning potential, etc. Period, end of story. We also relentlessly mock and scrutinize women who dare to be overweight in public. In fact, when you look at some of like the most aggressively thin celebrities now, many of them were people who were previously relentlessly mocked for being overweight. See also Kelly Osbourne. Like, it is so disingenuous to pretend as though being underweight and being overweight have the same implications in terms of how we perceive them as a society. One of them, aka being overweight, is already torn to shreds and negatively viewed. So pointing that out further, scrutinizing that further, is essentially just piling on. It's punching down. It's kicking someone when they're down. Like, it is unnecessary because that point is already being made 24/7. Conversely, a woman being extremely thin is celebrated, is normalized, is reinforced socially, financially, and all of the above. I watched almost every season of Emily in Paris, or as I call it, Coco Melon for adults. At no point in that show was anyone ever addressing the fact that Lily Collins is visibly, scarily, upsettingly underweight. It was celebrated. She was Carrie Bradshaw chic, wearing all of those high fashion looks that would have probably been perceived as, they were ridiculous on her too, but would have been perceived as unforgivable on someone who didn't have a very visibly underweight BMI. Like, being underweight is considered aspirational, diva. It's only when we reach the absolute extremes of it, tip over that very invisible line that we talked about at the beginning, that people start to take any kind of an issue with it. And then people relentlessly mock the person who was trying to achieve that thinness. So I don't think it's in any way comparable to comment honestly on one and be more sensitive to the other. I think that's just about acknowledging the reality of the society that we live in. Because, let's put it simply, young women, young impressionable girls are not giving themselves debilitating lifelong mental health and physical health disorders in the pursuit of being overweight. They're doing it in the reverse, but they're not doing it to be overweight. Does that happen occasionally? Yes. Is there another problem with getting into all kinds of negative feedback loops with health that lead to being overweight or obese? Absolutely. But that is not an aspirational thing to do. It's not what we're looking at when we see those aspirational ultra thin college girls doing their what I eat in a day videos. Only one is considered a slay. And I am aware that even by making this video, I am participating in the quote unquote discourse of commenting on a woman's body, and so be it. Because I think at some point, these very intentionally evasive platitudes about like, healthy looks different on everyone, or we don't know what someone's doing, or let's not comment on bodies, is being used as a cover and as a whitewashing to market and sell and glamorize incredibly sick individuals who are making it seem aspirational to be sick. To take it back to the Wicked press tour, so much of the discourse was, look how scary they look. Look how upsetting this is. Are they okay? Are they going in and out of the hospital? What's going on? Meanwhile, every magazine had a glamorous photo shoot with them in designer couture. Every red carpet was stopping in its tracks to photograph them. In every way, them being at the precipice of serious, serious illness was being celebrated and was being perceived as beautiful and luxurious and aspirational. And it only becomes easier to do that when any rightful conversation around what is happening with their bodies is shut down out of hand because you can't comment on a woman's body. Or they can gaslight us in real time by telling us that they're actually healthy. They've never been healthier. They're eating cheeseburgers and salmon rice bowls and a slice of chocolate cake for dessert. No, you are not, because we are not idiots. And we as women are not going to be fed this nonsense and told that if we in any way question it, that we're just being misogynist. No, actually, I think I'm being, if anything, protective over the many young, impressionable girls who are scrolling Skinny Talk as we speak, looking for tips on how to look like these sick women. Because trust me, every, in my opinion, terrifying photo that we looked at the beginning of this video of these women looking visibly, scarily ill, those can easily be found on any Thinspo page on any of your favorite social media platforms. Young girls find this aspirational and they want to learn how to do it. I'm going to end this video by saying the following. It is completely right and valid, and in my opinion, a normal human reaction to be utterly terrified at the rise of female celebrities looking beyond ill on the red carpet and that being normalized or celebrated. Yes. I think it is also disingenuous and unfair and at best incomplete to blame that on GLP-1s entirely, or to stigmatize that entire class of drugs as a result of some people misusing them, period. Third, we are still in a situation in America where the vast majority of Americans barely have access to healthy food. Let's start there. And are being constantly pushed the food that will addict us and make us sick and keep us on the hook for incredibly declining health outcomes, especially as we age. And by the way, you don't necessarily have to be an overweight or obese BMI to be suffering from a lot of these ill health outcomes. And on the flip side, being really thin, especially in the way a lot of these women are doing it, has absolutely nothing to do with health and is the opposite of health. Orthorexia be damned. But that is also part of it. And it is not inherently misogynist to remark on when women are marketing and glamorizing an extremely unhealthy ideal. And it is not the same thing as mocking a woman for daring to be overweight in the public space. Those are two very different things. I think all of these things can coexist. All of them can have nuance. And we can use our common sense for every step of that process. But that at least partially means shutting down the nonsense, shutting down the gaslighting, and shutting down the intentional dishonesty around what's actually happening on both sides of the extremes. Anyway, guys, thank you for bearing with me through that real minefield of a topic. I hope you guys won't be that mad at me. I sense some of you will, but I'll live with it. Bye.